Hello, this is Georgina Rose, and welcome back to the Dot on the YouTube channel. On this channel, we discuss everything related to magic, mysticism, religion, and everything on the fringe of esoterica. I'm your host, Georgina Rose, part-time esoteric content creator and part-time surfer of the Enochian Aethers. And in this video, we are going to be continuing my Planetary Magick series, which is basically a series where I take one of the 7 classical planetary bodies, and I explore the metaphysical meaning of what they are, the mysteries associated with them, various cults throughout history that were based around them, and how to engage with these planets in a planetary magic context. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about the moon. So I think it's worth discussing just a little bit about the moon astrologically. I think that's a good place to start. So while the moon is not a planet in an astronomical sense, astrologically speaking, the moon is technically considered a planet. It is a luminary if you want to get really, really technical, but we do consider the moon one of the planetary bodies. And what the moon represents is the moon represents, in its simplest form, the divine, feminine, and the subconscious. So elements-wise, the moon is aligned with water. And so all the things that relate to the element of water will also correspond to the moon. So we're thinking about what's in your psyche, what's in your soul, and what is beyond this exact level of existence. And when we look at the Kabbalah, which is a series of mystic beliefs that originate in Judaism and then flow into Christianity and then into Hermeticism and then into modern Western occultism, we see that the moon is corresponded to the spirit of Yesod. And so Kabbalah is represented through this thing called the Tree of Life. It's this diagram with all these spears, right? And so we are on Malkut, which is Earth, and then right above it in the center pillar, there is a pillar known as Yesod, and this is the spear of the moon. And so Kabbalah is kind of this chain hierarchy of metaphysical existence and being, and so the moon represents what is right beyond this layer of perception, so what is slightly above us, and that is within the pillar of equilibrium, which is that center pillar. So that means there are both active and reactive elements to the moon, which I'll get into in a little bit. But also this means that the astral plane, dreams, visions, all of this is happening in the layer of Yesod and is ruled by the moon. All things that happen in your dreams are lunar, which is why they happen at night, which is obviously the sect of the moon, and in your subconscious. That is why taking notes of your dreams can be highly valuable. So when we talk about the moon, I think it would be remiss to not mention the parts of the soul. So Carl Jung, who was the only psychologist that is really relevant in terms of metaphysics, he was a visionary and he merged esotericism and psychology in a very interesting way, believed that the soul is broken up into many parts. And this belief is actually a lot older than Carl Jung, but the modern version of it is very Jungian, and he said that there is the ego. He breaks it up in a lot of different parts, but 2 things that relate to the moon are the subconscious and the shadow. So there's this idea of shadow work that has become really popularized on the internet, and basically what it is in its original form is Jung believed we all had a shadow, which is our subconscious repressed self, part of the self that we do not confront on a daily basis, that we often pretend it doesn't even exist. And to have mastery over the shadow and to have mastery over our vices and disorders and things we don't understand, you actually need to dive into that shadow to understand it, make sense of it in a sort of know thyself way, and then integrate it into the whole of the self. And this is also why the moon has such an association with madness, right? The term lunatic, as a term to refer to a crazy person, actually does come from the idea of lunar, as since the moon is this kind of irrational self, the emotive self, which goes against the Stoic ideas of the rational, logical self, all sorts of mental distress is associated with the moon. And if you are someone who has pretty severe mental health issues in the realm of mood disturbances and emotional dysregulation, as backwards as it sounds, I really do recommend working with the moon, because you likely have issues with your relationship with the moon, and through working through this process of lunar evolution, you can actually have a lot more power over those parts of yourself. And speaking of signs, the sign that is most associated with the moon is the sign of Cancer, which is the sign that is part of the early summer. and has a lot to do with emotions. The big trait that's given to Cancers, I'm a Cancer sun myself, is that we are emotional little babies, and that's not entirely true, but that lunar quality is very much there. And so to understand your relationship to the moon based on your specific natal chart, I really recommend you pull up your natal chart and see what house Cancer is. So when you look at your wheel, right, you'll see that there is, and this is why you can't just read your co-star list, you need to look at the actual wheel. You will see that every sign is represented on your wheel, whether you're using whole signs or Placidus or whatever. This is easiest if you use whole signs, just because whole signs is so clean to look at. But set that chart to whole signs and see where Cancer falls, and then look up what that house means. Let's say it's in the 5th house. The 5th house is the house of fun, and so your emotional stuff will relate to that. As well, looking at the moon in your chart is going to be very important, specifically with what house that moon is in, because that's going to tell you a lot about, you know, what the moon relates to your life in, and what sign it is in. What sign your moon is in is how you are going to relate to emotions. For specifically, a Gemini moon is going to be very chaotic and dysregulated and all over the place. Now, the last thing I want you to look at is see what's aspecting your moon. So that's going to be all those lines coming off that lunar little symbol. And all those aspects are going to affect how other planets relate to your moon and can make huge, huge impacts on how all of those things relate to each other. As well, going a little bit further, looking at the exact degree, which is that little number that's going to be next to the moon icon, is going to tell you a lot about what lunar mansion your moon sign is in. I'll get in depth into the lunar mansions later in this video, but the lunar mansions are a way of dividing up the moon phases into further blocks. And seeing what lunar mansion you were born under is going to tell you a lot about the moon as well. So I really do recommend studying your natal chart and seeing what is strong in your natal chart and what is lacking in your natal chart if you want to be a planetary magician. You don't need to be a predictive astrologer to be a planetary magician, but you do need to have a base understanding of astrology to know what you are even looking at. So without further ado, I do want to get into the phases of the moon, because when we start to talk about working with the moon and doing actual planetary magic, the moon phases are super, super important, and they're going to be your guiding thing to look at first. And for many people who are brand new practitioners, learning the moon phases is one of the first things you learn. And that's for a reason, because it's a repetitive cycle that gets you into understanding the perennial cycle of life, death, and rebirth that exists throughout all things. And it happens so frequently that, you know, if you need to do a ritual relating to a specific part of this cycle, you know, it'll happen once a month. So the moon cycle is about 27 days, and it highly relates to tides. Once again, that moon-water connection. And I want to start with the first phase, and that would be the new moon. So the new moon is where everything begins. It's that first bit of light in the sky, and that is when I metaphysically mark the new moon. Right before that sliver of sky appears, there's what's called the dark moon, which was when it is complete darkness, and that dark moon has a very different metaphysical timbre to that first bit of light. So when you get that first bit of light, we're talking about the new moon. This is birth, right? This is the moment when we're thinking about the life cycle, we're talking about the actual process of birth, the first moment of anything. And so this is the time when you want to begin your cycle, right? Think of your rituals you do with the moon as a life cycle. I think that's the easiest way to conceptualize it. So then it's going to hit the first crescent. Right now you've got that little sliver. And the crescent moon is very significant in non-Western occultism. And if we're looking at lunar calendars and lunar months, often that first crescent marks the beginning of the month. Holy months in Islam are highly based off the crescent moon, and they are considered in Sufi mystic traditions the most powerful time of the month. So I do want to stress that even if you're a Western occultist, the full moon and the new moon are not the only metaphysically significant times of the month. Anyways, let's continue forward. So now you've got the waxing, which is the growing, gibbous. This also is first quarter, and then waxing, gibbous. Basically, the period where it's getting bigger, right? And so that is when things are coming into fruition. This is when you're going to want to be putting effort into your new projects and your new goals. And you want to be bringing things in, creating, generating, growing, right? Then it hits its peak on the full moon. Often the full moon is considered the most metaphysically profound point in the month. And in Wiccan-based traditions, the full moon is known as the S-bat. There is a specific ritual that is done on the full moon in Wiccan traditions called drawing down the moon. And this, it does appear, is a modern version of a tradition called drawing down the moon that goes back to ancient Greece and Rome. The full moon is heavily associated with witchcraft, and the idea of the witch's Sabbath, which was a sort of fantastical vision that was believed in post-Christian Europe, where basically women would engage with datura or henbane and basically these deliriant psychoactive herbs, and they would rub, and this is going to be graphic, I'm sorry, they would rub this herb onto broomsticks and then they would insert it in their vagina and go, whoo! Yeah, you get it? Anyways, this would cause them to have psychedelic visions because obviously that's a mucous membrane. And then they would visualize themselves flying out of their body and would seemingly experience this and would go to a specific mountain under the full moon, and then they would fly around and dance naked with other women who worshipped the witch god, right? Now, how much of this actually happened is incredibly historically disputed, but there are accounts of people that make me think this happened at least a few times. Or at least people did attempt this. So this is a big part of lunar magic throughout history. There are a lot of people who have kind of written these like witch texts. There's a specific one called Aradia that is a Italian text that disputably has a historic root. This guy, Charles Leland, found it, and he believed he had unearthed a secret witch cult that had existed in Italy since before Christianity. There are a lot of things in this text that do have roots in Italian folk magic, giving it a little bit of credibility, but there are other things that contradict a lot, so the veracity of this text is very debatable, but whether or not you believe it is literally real, this heavily influenced people who do moon magic, because things that are sacred texts in the Wiccan religion come from this text. And so the full moon is this moment of complete finality. It is the mother, right? You also can understand the idea of the mother, maiden, crone through the moon phases really well, with the maiden being the new moon and the waxing phases, the mother being the full moon, and then the crone being the waning phases. And so now let's get off the full moon and move into the waning phases. And so this is when you are going to want to start getting rid of things and doing magic to remove things from your life that no longer serve you, to finish things up. And then, of course, it continues all the way down through that last crescent, which is a very significant position in non-Western metaphysics. I once again want to stress the importance of the crescent moon in Sufi traditions and in magic that derivates from those cultures. And then we get to the dark moon, which is the last phase, and this is when it is complete darkness. And this, in our life, death, rebirth cycle, right, we had that birth at the beginning, life throughout this whole cycle, and then aging towards the end of it, and then death at the new moon. And now, start thinking about it. We've got that death at the dark moon, I meant to say death is dark moon, and then when you get that first sliver, you've got birth, and so it is rebirth, and we're seeing samsara itself every single month. It also is very common for people to do purgative rituals right at the dark moon, and then do consecration rituals right at the new moon. As well, if you are a woman, noting what your menstrual cycle is doing in relation to the moon cycle is very profound, because there are a lot of ways to do divination based on where your cycle falls, and basically integrate the divine feminine further using your natural cycle in its relationship to the moon. So one other way to break the moon phases up that I do want to talk about, that I don't think gets talked about enough, but it's something that I utilize heavily in my practice, is called the Lunar Mansions. So the Lunar Mansions are not typically used in Western astrology. They're not commonly used in Western planetary magic either, but I think they are incredibly interesting. So there are two systems of lunar mansions. One comes from Vedic astrology, which is from the Hindu cultures of India, and one comes from Arab astrology. Specifically, the version that I use is from the Shams al-Marif, which is a Islamicate, kind of heretical Islamicate text. I have a whole video on it. It's one of the most controversial occult texts ever written. But what I love about the Shams al-Marif is its exploration of the lunar mansions. And basically the lunar mansions, I do only know the Arab system of this, so please keep that in mind. I do not know the Vedic system of lunar mansions. So basically, there are 27 sub-delineations of the lunar cycle, because every month the moon goes through all the astrological signs, just like every year the sun goes through all the astrological signs, right? And so every month there are 27 mansions or houses think of them as like a literal mansion. That's how I like to think about it, right? Like the moon is kind of walking around like a weird version of suburbia, like a McMansion neighborhood. I don't know. And stopping at every single thing. And so all of these lunar mansions are named, and they all have specific levels of fortune or misfortune ascribed to them. And there are specific types of magic that are actually recommended. Like if you look at the lunar mansions in the text of the Shams al-Ma'arif, and the English abridged version does have this section, you'll see like magic related to fortune is recommended this day. It is recommended that you could only do cursing today. Today is a bad day to start projects. And so you can see every month what is going on day to day. So you can break up those moon phases even further and get an even more specific form of magic. Continuing with timing, when it comes to basic planetary timing, the best time to do lunar rituals are going to be on a Monday, because that is the moon day during a planetary hour of the moon. You can get the planetary hours for each day on an online calculator. You don't have to do that stuff by yourself anymore. Isn't technology wonderful? Actually, I hate technology, but this is one time where I do like technology. So now I want to talk about pagan gods and goddesses who relate to the moon, because one big way people approach planetary magic is through working with gods and goddesses that are related to the planetary sphere they are talking about. So when we talk about the moon, the most famous goddess is going to be Diana or Artemis. I think that is the one that is brought up the most. She is an incredibly useful goddess in these mysteries. She is the virgin goddess of the hunt, and she represents a very specific sort of maiden archetype of the moon. Selene is a moon goddess from the Hellenistic world who is heavily used in lunar magic. As well, when we look at moon goddesses around Europe, we see a heavy association between moon goddesses and motherhood, meaning that fertility-related magic can have a big place in the moon. As well, goddesses and gods that rule over emotions and consciousness have a lot to do with the moon. And one last type of goddess that we're going to see bring up when we talk about the moon, and it's going to deviate a bit from the other ones we've talked about, is goddesses like Hecate, which Hecate is the goddess of she's the goddess of witchcraft and outsiders and the fringes of society and a lot of other things, but she is actually also a moon goddess. She is just a very different aspect of the moon. And so we see that chthonic, dark feminine having a role in the moon too. I mean, think about the moon itself. There's a light side and a dark side to the moon. And so the moon is not wholly like a maternal archetype. Like when we understand that life, death, rebirth, mother, maiden, crone cycle, we understand that it is not just the mother, it is also the maiden, like Diana, the mother like Selene, and the crone like Hecate. And so there's a lot of different ways to take lunar magic based on that. Now, I do want to address that in some other cultures, the moon is not related to goddesses. And that's where I want to bring back that Kabbalah thing I mentioned at the beginning. So the moon has a heavy divine feminine association, and ritual tools associated with the moon are like the chalice, which the chalice is that cup used in ritual. It's obviously very yonic. It's pretty literal, but there are some cultures that ascribe male gods to the moon, but they do appear a little bit differently. I specifically want to talk about the pre-Islamic. Oh my God, do not get on my case and cancel me again for bringing this up. So I want to scream that pre-Islamic Arab pagan, okay? Getting you people off my case before you start. So the pre-Islamic Arab pagan interpretation of Allah, because Allah predates Islam. There's a lot of historical records of this. Die mad. Allah was a god who was heavily associated with the Crescent Moon, and his Mesopotamia equivalent, who was also a moon god named Sin, had the same association. And when we look at male gods that relate to the moon, we see sort of masculine expressions of emotion and the emotional nature connected to it. And so, you know, even when the moon is not feminine, the moon is still emotional, because, and let's be real, men have emotions. I think there's this like massive belief that men are all these like stoic, non-emotional creatures, and that's, I mean, it's a disservice to men, but it's also just completely dishonest. Honestly, I've met a lot of men. Y'all can be emo too, okay? Let's be real. So moon gods are a thing, and outside the West, there are many cultures that actually make the moon masculine and the sun feminine. As well, in Europe, Nordic culture does the same thing. So if you wanted to start doing lunar magic, where would you begin? So you can work with a personification of the moon god or goddess. that's a great place to start. And by simply developing a devotional relationship to those gods and goddesses, you can have a lunar relationship and it can grow from there. If we're talking about ceremonial magic traditions, the Greek Magick papyri, which is one of the few ceremonial magic texts that we have from antiquity that is actually ancient in nature, talks a lot about the moon. There are a lot of like planetary squares to the moon that are in there and a lot of numeric attributions that are really, really valuable. And a lot of these stuff in the PGM actually uses Hecate as a sort of opposite to Helios, which is a very interesting way to do a sun-moon dynamic. I find that so fascinating whenever I see that done, because that's not like something I would initially think of putting as like a god-goddess pairing, but it actually works really, really well. I've used it in ritual. So Greek Magick papyri is going to be probably your best resource for ceremonial lunar magic. But when we look at more modern traditions, it comes up to like all those modern ceremonial traditions involve the moon. And I do want to stress that you do not have to be Wiccan to have a moon devotion. Wicca is very moon-centric, but Wicca is not the only tradition that uses the moon. And as Wicca falls out of favor as time progresses, I think we're going to see a lot of new moon cults emerge. I have noticed worship to Diana has become really big, which I find very, very cool. So don't have this association moon equals Wicca equals witchcraft, right? Witchcraft has a history with the moon. To deny that is crazy, but to say like all lunar stuff equal witchcraft is historically ignorant and just kind of dumb. When we're talking about mysticism itself, you can have a mystic devotion to the moon, absolutely. And I actually think looking at non-Western traditions is going to give you a lot more insight on how to do that, because since Western religion like Christianity are so solar in nature, looking at mystical traditions like Sufism is going to give you a much clearer way to understand lunar-based mysticism, because there's a lot of lunar devotions written into those traditions and are present there. So definitely like think about all of this. Like you can be a mystic, you can be a witch, you can be an occultist. All of this can relate to the moon, because the moon is fundamentally a luminary and a planetary body, and thus the moon exists in every single planetary system. So that's all I have to say for this video. I do have one really exciting announcement. I am hosting a group trip with Trova Trip to Greece, where we're going to see a bunch of amazing esoteric heritage sites and also just like have a lot of fun as a community. That is now open for registration, and the first 10 people who sign up get $300 off. So if you want to come, you should sign up now. Not all the payment is due at once. It's like broken up. And you can support me on Patreon. On Patreon, you get a bonus video every month, a ritual guide, and if you're a high enough tier, we can do a mentorship type arrangement where I can help you through esotericism. And I also host the podcast, The Postmodern Iconoclast. You can listen to it on this YouTube channel or on most podcasting platforms. And I am Georgina Rose, or Dot Darling. I am on Instagram, TikTok, Telegram, Twitch, Patreon, Substack, YouTube, and I think that's it. Threads. I'm also on Threads. I forget that I'm on Threads a lot of the time. But I'm on every social media platform under the sun. Please like, comment, subscribe, and ring the bell. And if subscribed for 93 days, you'll meet the Horror Guardian Angel, and you'll never need to know what the moon is again. All right, see you guys in the next one. Bye!